of course, Emily had this ambitious idea of crossing time zones and also crossing continents when we talk about data for policy. And so, as you know, last week we started off in Hong Kong, then we went to Seattle, and now, of course, we had this wonderful full day of conversations around data for policy in Brussels. And so what we hope to do is to actually reflect on what are some of the common themes, what are themes that were different, and how does that lead to actually another future agenda with regard to data for policy as well. But Emily is going to tell me something that I need to know. No.
I apologize that I didn't realize the microphones would have not the light for the whole day. So we've got one functioning microphone and the other's being recharged.
Great.
So hopefully this one will last.
So what I will do with the lasting microphone is to first give you a reflection on because Zeynep and I were in Seattle, and of course we were also trying to keep an eye on what happened in Hong Kong, was to give you my reflections on what were the clusters that emerged during that conversation especially in Seattle. And then I will ask first Barbara, because Barbara has to get also on the train, so we make sure that you don't miss that. And then Francesco to reflect whether those clusters that I identified in Seattle, and actually a lot of course, I could also reflect on what was discussed here vis-a-vis those clusters, but I think it would be good to let Barbara reflect on, does that resonate? And if so, in what way did it manifest? And does it manifest itself in this region of the world? And then also, Francesco, if there is anything that I forgot that he says this was actually something that, and from my point of view, there are distinctive elements that emerged in today's conversation that would be good to have as well, in the hope that we ultimately perhaps can galvanize that in a blog that we can share in, anyway, some kind of reflections across the time zones and regions as well. And so as it relates to the clusters that I identified as distinctive topics that emerged in Seattle and also in Hong Kong, I think the first one was that it's really about trust, and that we really need to understand how you get trust in actually data for policy, and that quite often is related with reliability, but also with the kind of actors that were involved. And again, today we might have heard that as well, is that at the top, anyway, we cannot have data for policy without actually understanding what is trust and how do you get trust in how data for policy is established. And of course, there are a whole range of issues associated with trust, but I think that was definitely a cluster that emerged in the other regions as well. The second, which might be less pronounced here, but was definitely pronounced in the other regions, was in order to perhaps even establish trust, it's really important to focus on legitimacy behind data for policy, which is really about who actually is behind the use of data for policy. Are there legitimate actors involved, and how do they get legitimacy as well, which is then also linked with this notion of stewardship, and to what extent can you actually have legitimate stewardship of data, and does that contribute to trust? And there's a whole range of topics that emerged around that topic. The third cluster, which again I thought was very interesting and somewhat different in the other regions, was really the cluster of equity, meaning in Seattle, not every single panel basically focused on equity, and to what extent, if you're using data for policy, to what extent is it done in an equitable manner, meaning does everyone benefit in an equal manner if you actually start using data, and is everyone represented in the data as it relates to using data for policy, which then was linked with this other aspect, which quite often explains equity, which was linked with notions of power asymmetries, that this whole field of data for policy is actually determined and quite often characteristic or characterized by power asymmetries, which means quite often those that have data don't share it, those that need data don't have it and need to have access to data, and there's quite often also asymmetries with regard to who has agency over the use of data as it relates to data for policy. So that was the third cluster. The fourth cluster was really about, is it locally relevant, right? I mean, you can have a lot of data for policy efforts at the national level, but by the end of the day, it has to be locally relevant in order to be impactful. And that was a big topic area, which then again, quite often was linked with participatory ways on how you go about establishing data for policy, with the assumption that it's easier to be participatory at the local level, at the community level, as opposed to at the national level. And so that was the fourth kind of cluster. And again, too short time to actually touch on all the issues there. But the fifth one was really about value and the need to establish value, and the need to, despite the fact that we are now 10 years in, for instance, the open data movement or longer, but that the need for documenting value remains as important as it was at the beginning, that it's still about documenting value and so on. And of course, related to that, the complexity, which we heard in the last panel, the complexity of actually establishing value, right? And the need to really develop new methodologies for values. But linked with that, and again, especially in Seattle, was then also the need to document shared benefit. And it was interesting that the last discussion here was also about shared value, but by shared benefits was also about, does everyone in the community benefit from actually from the value of data, right? And is the benefit shared? And there was a lot, especially a lot of discussion in Seattle around, for instance, indigenous communities that actually don't have that shared benefit of data being used for policymaking, but then they don't see kind of the return on their own communities, let alone do they have agency in order to establish what value they want to have created from the data as well. The sixth was really about capacity and the need for establishing capacity, both at the level of skills, right, but also at the level of infrastructure, and that there is need for a lot more investment in both technical infrastructure, but also a human infrastructure, right, which again goes back to this kind of need for new positions, such as data stewards, but also others that are needed in order to understand what data for policy can do. And then the seventh cluster, and I only have 7, Barbara, so I see Barbara getting nervous with regard to the amount of clusters that she has to respond to. But the 7 was really about, again, the importance of openness, right? And both openness in terms of open data, but also in terms of open models, but also openness with regard to the use of data for policy and the need for being transparent there as well. But that then got countered as well by then, yes, openness, but to a large extent, it should also be going hand in hand with the notion of self-determination, right? And being able for certain communities to determine what is open, right? Because in some cases, communities might be harmed if their data is made open without having agency to what extent their data has been made open, right? And so openness, while it is seen as kind of a normative value, can also be seen as actually a challenge for certain kinds of communities if they are not part in the determination of what is open and what is not open. And so these were just 7 clusters of topics that emerged as relates to data for policy. And as I said, what would be interesting to have Barbara reflect on, and then Francesco, is do those 7 clusters resonate in the context of this region that we've heard today? Which ones did we forget, or how did they manifest differently as opposed to what we've heard in the other regions, which is of course the benefit of doing this across regions, to see what is different and is there certain kind of priorities or emphasis that might be different in different regions. And I think actually there is a lot of kind of interesting insights that we can have from those 3 panels as well. Over to you, Barbara.
Thank you, Stefan. I'm not sure I'll be as structured as you've been, but definitely the clusters, my first reaction is that the clusters resonate. Perhaps I'm not sure that if I had been asked to cluster here the topic that came out, I'm not sure I would have clustered them in the same way. I'm trying to explain. For example, there was a lot of conversation around regulations, the role of regulations, the role of laws. And I wonder if, given that we are in Brussels and given that in the European context, the relevance of European acts for administrations, for governments is heavy. I wonder if that's the reason why there was so much in the different presentations as well. Emphasis and focus on regulations and how these support, for example, data access and data sharing. Certainly, there was a whole set of comments and conversations around capacities and skills and people. So that resonates with the capacity and infrastructure. There was a lot on AI here. So not only the great presentation given by Gianluca, but in many of the other papers presented, for example, the connection between data and AI and the ethical use of both, I think came up pretty strongly. There was a lot around openness. So not only the specific session on open data, but, the idea of the conditions for making it open, the idea of what data to make open, the sustainability of the openness of the data, the incentives. Those are things that came up, I think, around the point on openness. A lot came out around standards as enablers for interoperability and data sharing. So I don't know if these could be made be part of the capacity and infrastructure, but that came up a lot. And then the three last points, policymakers and the role and the need to bring policymakers on board and making them understand the value of data for their job came up pretty strongly. So I don't know if that's part of the trust or if there's a whole point on what you and I would define the governance of data that came up. I think here that I would say it's a cluster, the regulations, the role of policymakers, the standards as part of the governance. Then the sustainability came up a lot. And last, impact. So either, because we spoke about the cost benefits, or what you named in the other group around the benefits, for example, but the whole conversation around impact. What impact? How do you measure impact? How do you monitor it? Came up quite strongly. So I have to say it resonates, perhaps not grouped in the same way, and that's perhaps a reflection.
Thank you very much. So from my point of view, yeah, the clusterization more or less resonates. Equity has not been that stressed, I would say, here in Brussels with respect to what happened in the US, and also agency and data sovereignty, and also the power to decide who can use my data and how my data will be used and how my data will circulate. But also something that probably should have been more stressed, it's about data for environmental sustainability. So we talked a lot about sustainability, but more from the business point of view, continuation, exploitation, and business continuity. On the other hand, a part of the debate that probably it's going to be very important in the next years will deal with technologies and software that will improve the energy efficiency of the use of data. And in that regard, there are several applications at the moment. For instance, new application based on edge that in principle will decrease the latency in computation, and in principle will decrease, let's say, heating of data centers, will decrease the consumption of energy. So they are in principle more sustainable from the environmental point of view. And I think that this might be a very interesting strand for the conference in 2023. So I would like to push this kind of agenda for the future.
Great, thanks so much. And this was very insightful to really reflect on governance and sustainability were more pronounced here, and I agree with that than they were in the previous session. Although environmental stewardship came up in Seattle as well, and perhaps that's how we can also position it as environmental stewardship as part of data stewardship might become an important topic area. With that, I want to also open up, and I realize we have 15 more minutes before we have some drinks to even go into more detail on what this is, because I thought this is actually an opportunity also. A lot of the panels were rushed because there was so much to be discussed, but also we have perhaps another 15 minutes here to have you reflect on what were some of the topics that you feel stood out today that might require further attention in future data for policy events. And if Zeynep is online, who is of course anyway the mother behind this whole conference series, if she wants to also make some reflections and is feasible to share and connect, that would be great as well. But anyone in the audience, so that we actually hear from you as well. Yeah, Sarah. I think you do need a microphone, and there is Emily is always right when you need her. She is. And Emily, can you see whether Zeynep wants to join as well to give some final? There's a hand there, but we can't see who it is. Yes, Sarah, over to you. Yeah, no, go ahead.
So I think one thing that was surprising to me, I think today we talk a lot about policymakers and governments, but then when you think about policymaking and governance, we talk less about citizens and sort of how democratic governments are elected and how they represent the interests of citizens. So sometimes I was missing sort of that final piece where I'm like, what does that do for citizens, or how are citizens engaged, involved, included in some of these things? So that was something that just was highlighted for me.
Some reflections on this was something that stood out. Is Zeynep?
Hello, hi, can you hear me? Is that all right? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can you now.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Stefan, and thank you really everyone. And I'm very sorry that I couldn't make it there in person. It was beyond me, unfortunately. But I have been following all the sessions as much as I could since morning. I did actually follow all three conferences. I started with Hong Kong, and then we went to Seattle in person, and this one. Just maybe, well, my main takeaways actually in all three regions. I think we achieved something that we really intended at the beginning, but we didn't know that we would achieve in the end. Basically, what we tried to do with this three region model was to capture the different types of behaviors emerging around digital innovation, data science innovation, particularly relevant to obviously governance and policy. And what I observed in the Hong Kong presentations, for example, they were really a lot more focused on the technology itself. So there was a lot of focus on the cyber physical element of ecosystem interpretation of the ecosystem that we have included in the title of this conference. So what we have come across, for example, there were lots of conversations around Japanese society 5.0, so really essentially combining the physical and virtual in a metaverse-like idea, actually, around a metaverse-like idea, to imagine different futures. So I did see a lot more sort of direct attempts and actually brave attempts as well, I could say, into rethinking about how the future could look like with the help of all these technologies and innovations. In Seattle, whereas I saw more emphasis on open infrastructure, Stefan has summarized that quite a lot. So it was the open infrastructure, and also the development aspect came a lot. I think that actually reflected to the interests or our hosts probably in the first place, but also I mean from where I look at from US's sort of the US ecosystem as different to the Asia and Europe, perhaps it reflected well to that as well, I thought. Well, I should also mention in Hong Kong, we were hosted by a more technology-focused institution, Hong Kong University of Technology and Science. In Seattle, we were hosted by Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and then University of Washington. So there was the focus on development, I think, came also quite a lot from that perspective. And we also actually used the opportunity to launch a new initiative, our Africa Inclusion Initiative in Seattle as well, that we couldn't discuss in this edition, but you will hear about it later on. And in here, obviously, you're hearing, you're there, so you know much better than I do. But what I'm hearing is a lot of more regulation conversations that is really speaking to the nature of the European approach to these sort of things. I would agree, and a lot more mention of democracy, actually directly democracy and sort of rights part of, so trying to get these things right, and also trying to navigate around bureaucratic structure as well. Well, bureaucracy wasn't mentioned explicitly, but again, I think it reflects to the nature of our probably interests of our hosts as well, Lisbon Council, and quite sort of established involvement from the European Commission colleagues as well. There was a lot of this regulation nature and regulation nature, which I think speaks to the how these things basically manifest themselves in a bureaucratic environment, established bureaucratic environment. I don't mean to use it in a bad way. I mean it's more like institutional and more trying to really regulate the whole process. So I should really stop here. I know that there is very little time left, and I would love to hear from others in the room as well. Do please let us know what you've thought, what you have in mind, and for each conference we are really trying to capture the sort of the spirit of the conversation at the time. And when we launched this conference, metaverse was to establish, was to be announced as a big thing. It was, everybody was hearing, but it wasn't yet named as metaverse yet that much. And the virtual, the three center ecosystems, again, it was quite the point that everybody was talking about. So now the effort is going to basically think about what the next conference is going to look like, and what is the actually essence of the digital and data science innovation, particularly for the public sector and governance in 12 to 15 months from now as well. So thank you.
Great. So with that, I'm opening the floor again. And I think also just to build upon, and again, Francesco and Barbara, if you have other reflections, I think part of doing this kind of comparative set of conferences was also to somewhat debunk the kind of narrow perspective that there are only three models, right? So you have the European model, you have the US model, and then you have the China model. And so I think what we've seen is that there are many more models, right? And there are many models that are similar. They are somewhat different. Somewhat, anyway, the emphasis is different on certain kinds of aspects than in different regions. But
Okay, sound is gone on our end. We can't hear you anymore.
So my mic died. I think that's the signal that I have to stop talking. But so Zeynep, I was just saying that it was also about testing the three model kind of paradigm, that there are only three models, Europe, US and China, and that we've seen that there are many different approaches, but also approaches across the three models that are actually similar, right? So any other reflections, any suggestions on topics that you feel didn't address, but you felt would be valuable to address? Yes? I have the mic.
Hi. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, so I kind of, I mean, it's been alluded to today, but I kind of, there's one thing I'm interested in, perhaps for future conversations a bit more, which is, you know, this desire we have for openness and transparency, as well as privacy. So there's a kind of paradox where if we want people to participate legitimately, we need to understand their identity, because otherwise we don't know that they're legitimate and that they are speaking, you know, honestly from the interests to which they're supposed to. But because we have such high wealth, power, inequality in the world, when we provide opportunities for participation, then obviously we can have astroturfing, this kind of sock puppets, whatever you want to call it, whether it's a PR machine, whether it's obvious or whether it's kind of hidden, that voices are in our data that are not who they claim to be. So I mean, I don't personally focus on that matter. I've kind of referenced a bit in my work, but I just really feel that that is such a big challenge. How do we achieve privacy and transparency and participation when, you know, when there's this problem with identity and legitimacy? So that would be. Oh, hi, yeah, it's Mariam Cook. I'm from the University of Exeter.
Yeah, very interesting. And this was also a discussion that came up actually, which was this whole issue of to what extent do you want to have disaggregated data, for instance, right? Which is then the question of, anyway, there was a whole discussion about disaggregated data with regard to ethnic background, for instance. And in some countries, this is being pushed heavily now. In the US, anyway, they want to, for equity purposes, they want to have full disaggregation of ethnic background, but in other context, it might actually be harmful, right? To actually have that kind of level of disaggregation. And so, which is similar like the identity issue. That's an interesting tension.
A quick point that came to me is actually was being raised in the breakout rooms with Apti Institute was around this notion about the sustainability of public participation and engagement. And actually that conversation got me to rethink about this notion of incentivization or incentives. I mean, these terms have been came across in so many discussions about how we can incentivize the public to engage in a discussion. But maybe another way we can approach this is to challenge this notion of incentives. Is this a process really about what we can provide, or is it actually about, you know, what is actually needed in the system? Probably is not about what kind of measures we can provide, rather than what effort we can bring onto the table to raise awareness or the needed education to help the people to install the confidence in the different communities in the group to make sure that their participation and engagement can actually lead to changes in different issue areas that they would like to see the changes in. So from that perspective, I think the focus is no longer just about what kind of incentives that can be provided, rather than to look at what are the actually approaches we can do to build the confidence from the bottom up approach. And I think that is something that probably we need to reflect more on. And another aspect is regarding around the different models. I mean, I feel like from my observation, I noticed a lot of discussions comes into, you know, how we can collaboratively, we're finding this kind of universal approach to bring different actors together. I think this is definitely on the right direction, but maybe there's also in parallel, we should also give some attention towards how we can create a harmony among different models or different ideologies and different approaches, and how we can ensure such diversities can coexist in the current society, and we can still build on differences. We can find rooms or topics for collaborations in different areas. Yeah.
Great, thanks. Steve, you have your hand up?
Yeah, just a brief point. But first, I just wanted to respond to Zeynep's point about the format of the event. I think that's really excellent and really important to build up that sort of global perspective on these matters and look at differences, different understanding of democracy, etc. But my point hark back to something that came up in one of the earlier talks in our session, which was about the quadruple helix model, obviously bringing together government, academia, business and citizens, if you like. And one of the challenges we face, and I think it's sort of been discussed here, is how do we better capture citizens' perspective in what I'm calling the governance, but actually the management, if you like, of the systems, data sharing systems we're talking about. And I think that's sort of something that's perhaps emerged through some of the different talks today, and I suspect something that'll be repeated, but that's something that we'll be looking at in the future. That was what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. Any final observation? I think everyone is ready for drinks. Unfortunately, it's not glue wine. I think that's what probably most people could benefit from at the moment, but I think it's going to be other wine. With that, let me first thank Francesco for all the efforts that went into organizing today's event. And Francesco wants to make sure that we have no privacy here and wants to take a picture of the whole group. So make sure that we know who was in the room, but also thank Emily, of course, and I want to thank Andrew, who is in the back, and Ron, yeah, Ron. And of course, thanks all of you for coming here and to submit your papers, to attend the panels, and to especially to be here while the temperature was dropping throughout the day and stay involved as well. As you know, the conference also has a journal, Data and Policy. And if you have any idea on a paper, whether it's a translational paper or it's an academic paper you want to submit based upon today or based upon a future thing you might want to write, let us know, and we would be delighted to have you publish at Data and Policy as the ongoing community in between conferences. Thanks so much.